Great. Well, good evening, everybody. And Leonie, thanks for that introduction. Yeah, as Leonie said, I will be introducing JHipster to you for those of you that don't know it, and for those of you that have heard about it and have never seen it before. We'll go through a short demo as well, and I'll tell you about the history about it and yeah, where we are now. So without further ado, let's get started. So first of all, this is the agenda for this evening. I'll just introduce myself, and then I'll tell you what is JHipster. I'll tell you a little bit about the history, the technology stack, both on the back end, the front end, deployment, as well as CI/CD. We'll be looking at some JHipster tooling. Then I'll give a hands-on demo. No technical talk is a proper technical talk without a live demo. And then we'll have some closing thoughts and some time for a Q&A session as well. So just to introduce myself, that's me with my lovely family, my two boys. I am from South Africa and at a little town called Somerset West. And if I switch over, I can, for those of you that don't know, I can show you where it is. So if we are here in the Netherlands and we zoom out all the way, fly across Africa, all the way down to South Africa. And if we zoom in, there's Cape Town coming into picture. That big bay there is called False Bay. It's known for all the great white sharks. And over there is a little town called Somerset West. And this is where we're from. And this is very close to Stellenbosch, which is quite well known for the wine region of South Africa. So that's where we're from. On a personal note, myself and my family love traveling. That's one of the reasons why we're here. I like to stay active, and I do a little bit of everything. That includes running, cycling, golf, tennis, skiing, and it looks like this season is looking to be a good season for skiing. So let's keep our fingers crossed for that. Let's just hope that Corona doesn't disrupt that. And then, of course, as you'll see later in the presentation, I also like rockets. So that's the theme for this evening, for this talk at least. And then just for fun, this is a picture of myself and a good mate of mine, Andre de Toy, who used to be my cycling buddy back in South Africa. And yeah, what you see there in the background is in fact blue sky. And if you look closely there, those things are called mountains. So anyway, I thought that might be interesting to you as well. Anyway, on a professional level, I studied computer science and electronic engineering at the University of Stellenbosch. And at the moment, I'm a software engineer and solutions architect, aka problem solver at Capgemini. Throughout my career, I've worked in a few countries, and some of the highlights include Italy, where I worked at the European Gravitational Observatory, and the project was called Virgo. And the reason I mention that is because it's quite interesting. It's an experiment, the only experiment in Europe that do research on gravitational waves. And they, in fact, found gravitational waves a few years back. So that's a big accomplishment. Then I also did a short stint in Australia, spent a lot of time in South Africa working at various companies, and now I'm in the Netherlands. So what do I like about software? Well, I really enjoy how to get more done with less, and that's probably why I'm quite excited about JHipster. It's all about efficiency and productivity, and then obviously very important at the same time have fun. So that's my philosophy as far as that's concerned. Right, enough about myself. I think let's get to it. So I just want to set the scene in terms of the scope for tonight's talk. We'll really be just scratching the surface of it, or to put it another way, we'll be looking at the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the title says it all. It's an introductory session. So hopefully this will give you enough information to go poke around at your own time and yeah, experiment further with it. I hope I give you enough information to you that yeah, find it interesting, and then have a look at it by yourself. Right, so let's get started. What is JHipster? So for those of you that come from a web development background, you might be familiar with what a Yeoman generator is. That's often used to scaffold web applications. But what the guys did with JHipster is actually use that same concept, but instead of just scaffolding a web application, they scaffold a full-blown application, including the backend. And initially, this was created with Maven, Spring, and Angular. But over the years, this evolved really to become a development platform to basically generate, develop, and deploy modern web applications, and then also microservices. So what is the goal of JHipster? So this comes from the website, and I'm pretty much going to read it verbatim. Our goal is to generate a complete and modern web app or microservice architecture unifying a high-performance and robust server-side stack. So that's very important. It's got a big focus on the backend. Then also on the front end, it's got a focus on a sleek, modern, mobile-first UI with either Angular, React, or Vue, and then also using Bootstrap. It's not only an application generator anymore. It's now has become also a full-blown workflow companion tool. So you don't just scaffold your application and get started with it. You can use the tool throughout your development process. It's built on the front end using Webpack, and then on the back end either Maven or Gradle, which some of you might be familiar with. It has the option to generate a microservices architecture, and this includes keeping in mind cloud native principles. So obviously these days Kubernetes and that sort of thing are very hip. So it's modern in that regard. And then also it's leveraging infrastructure as code. So you can quickly deploy it to the cloud. So a little bit about the history, just to give you some context. JHipster is about 8 years old, and the reason I'm mentioning that is it's not a flash in the pan. It's been around for a while, and it's obviously gone through the growing pains and that sort of thing. So it's fairly stable now. The first release was made in 2013 with the 0.028 release. The current release is 7.4.1. So as you can see, it's been through a lot of incarnations. This I pulled from the website. It's used by 43,000 people. Now, I suspect it's probably more than that, but that gives you an indication of how broadly it's being used. And at the moment, there are over 620 contributors to that. So it's quite an active community. Right, let's have a look at what it consists of. At the back end, it is built on top of the Spring framework. It's leveraging Spring Boot. It's making use of Spring Security. It's including Spring Data, amongst other things. So very much comfortable with the Spring framework. It started off on top of Java, but now it also includes Kotlin. So later on, we'll hear a talk by Jan Mostert, who will talk more about Kotlin. Kotlin is very hip these days as well. But some people in the community have also ported this to Node and also .NET, which is very interesting. On the back end, it's leveraging the build tool Maven or Gradle. On the persistence side, it supports relational databases through JPA and then also Liquibase. For NoSQL, it's got support for Couchbase, Mongo, Neo4j, and also Cassandra. It includes multiple cache technologies, including distributed caching technologies. It's got support for Kafka. It's got support for Elasticsearch. It's got built-in monitoring technologies. This includes the ELK stack. ELK stands for Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. And then obviously Prometheus and Grafana, which is leveraged off the Spring Actuator project. Also including testing frameworks on the back end, and then specifically for microservices, it includes Eureka, Consul, Zool, and Trafic, which is pretty much built on the code donated by Netflix, the Netflix open source software stack. So to continue to the front end, and I just want to put out a disclaimer there. I'm not a front end expert, so we're gonna not focus so much on the front end, but it has got support for Angular originally, and then later on when React and Vue became more popular, it also included support for those frameworks. It's built on TypeScript, which is modern. It's leveraging Webpack for the building of the front end, and also on the front end supports testing. If we look at the deployment support, it's obviously leveraging Docker and then also Kubernetes. And as I mentioned before, it's got support for deploying to multiple cloud providers, including AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, Spring Cloud, OpenShift, Heroku, and also Cloud Foundry. If we jump to support for CI/CD, it's got support for Jenkins, Travis, GitLab, CircleCI, Azure Pipelines, and GitHub Actions. Now, I haven't used all of those. I have used Jenkins, GitLab, and Azure Pipelines, but I believe the others are supported as well. So if we look at what's required for the development environment, it's actually not a lot. The only thing that you really need to pre-install is Java, obviously your JDK, and then also Node and NPM or Yarn if you prefer to use Yarn. And then what is optional is to have Docker installed. Some of the sort of like supporting tools are leveraging Docker. If you want to spin up a Prometheus server or Grafana or your databases for that matter. And then obviously you have the choice of what IDE you want to use. As I said before, it's leveraging Maven or Gradle on the back end. So IDE is not that important, but yeah, I mean, my IDE of choice is IntelliJ IDEA. So to look at the tooling, JHipster consists of a lot of tools. I think the most important one is obviously the CLI, the command line interface tool, which is something I'll show you. Then something that I leverage quite a lot is the JDL or the JHipster domain language, and this is specifically used to model your application, specifically your domain model. And there's also a JDL Studio for that, which I'll show you. So that then brings me to the next slide, which is pretty much to set the stage for the demo we're going to do tonight. So as I mentioned before, the theme for the evening is rockets. As you see there, that's a launch of the Falcon Heavy. And what we're going to be building tonight is a full stack application called Spaceflight. And I'll show you the domain model later. But this is what we're going to do. And I'm going to use that to show you the JHipster CLI. So I'm going to switch screens and present my terminal to you now. So I hope this is clear enough, but I've got JHipster pre-installed already. So if I go type in JHipster version, I'm not running the latest. I'm running 7.2.0, which doesn't matter. But what we're going to do now is we're going to create a full-blown application which consists of a backend as well as a front end. So let's get started. So how we do that is just type JHipster, and it's going to launch the application. And the first thing it's going to ask is whether you want to build a monolithic application or a gateway application or a microservices. So the gateway and microservices application is out of scope for tonight. So we're going to choose the monolith. And let's call it Spaceflight. That's the name of the application. Do you want to make it reactive? Let's say no. It's got support for Spring for the reactive programming model, but we're not going to use that tonight. What is the default Java package name? Let's just say demo Spaceflight. As I said before, it supports Spring Security. So you've got the option of either using JWT authentication or OAuth, and there it supports both Keycloak and Okta, or HTTP session authentication, which is stateful, but we're going to go with JWT, and then we're going to implement our security leveraging the database. So let's use that. The next question is which database we want to run. So let's go for a SQL database in production. So we'll say SQL. I'm going to choose MySQL. It's going to ask us what we want to run for the development database. And let's make use of the H2 database with disk-based persistence. The next question is regarding the cache, and here you've got a few options: Caffeine, Hazelcast, Infinispan, Memcache, or Redis, or the option of no cache at all. But let's just, for the sake of this, choose EHCache for a local node, since we're running on a local machine. Do we want to make use of Hibernate second level cache? Yes, let's just choose the default. What build tool do you want to use, Maven or Gradle? I'm going to choose Maven. Then the next question is, do you want to use the JHipster registry? In this case, also no. And then some of the options, as I mentioned before, do we want to include support for Elasticsearch, WebSockets, Apache Kafka, or API first development? I invite you to play around with this later, so I'm not going to choose any of this now. And then the option is for the front end. So all the previous questions relates to the backend. So what do we want to do for the front end? I'm quite a fan of Vue, so let's choose Vue. Do we want to generate the admin UI? Yes, we want to do that, and that's part of the demo later. The next question is, what theme do we want to use? Now, there are a few themes that you can look out on the Bootswatch webpage. I'm just going to go for the default one. And this is maybe a funky little facility as well. Do we want to support internationalization? And that's very easy to do, so let's choose yes. We want to do English by default, and since we're in the Netherlands, choose Dutch, and just for the fun of it, also choose French. This is the testing frameworks on the front end, which I'm, for the purpose of this presentation, just going to ignore. And then the last question is, would you like to install other generators? Now, I'm going to come back to this. I'm not going to install anything else, but I will refer later in this presentation, what other options there are in the marketplace as well. So what you're going to see now is, if I press this button, it's going to scroll past with a whole bunch of line prints, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to scaffold our whole application. So let's see where the magic starts to happen. And there we go. Now this might take a little bit of time, and for the sake of saving time, I'm going to switch over, because what I want to show you next is actually the JDL Studio that I referred to as well. So what we're going to build is, we're going to build a silly little application consisting of the following domain objects. Let's call it a mission, the rocket, and the payload. And if I switch screens again, I want to show you what the studio looks like. So if I go back to this screen, this is the JDL Studio. And this is where you can actually design your domain model for your application. And it's very straightforward. It's got some syntax that you have to learn, but it's very easy. For those of you that are familiar with the UML, it might be familiar, but basically you create your entities, you give it a name, you give it a type, whether it's required or not. So in this case, just the mission, it's got a name, it's got a date. By the way, these are all Java types, and it's got a launch location. This is drawn for you. So if I, for example, type anything here, payload, let's say weight integer, it'll add it for you. So this happens on the fly, and it gives you a nice visual presentation of your domain model. It's got support for enumerations. So if we look at rocket type, those of you that are familiar with the SpaceX rockets, we've got Falcon 1. That's a duplicate, so that shouldn't be there. The Falcon 9 Block 4, Falcon 9 Block 5, and then the Falcon Heavy. Payload type, satellite or astronaut. And then this is used for where you model your relationships. So this is a one-to-many relationship from mission to payload. And this is a one-to-one relationship. And there's obviously support for many-to-many as well. So for those of you that are familiar with JPA or Hibernate, this should be all familiar. Some of the details further below, it's got the option to use DTO objects. Now, DTO stands for data transfer objects. and it's leveraging a library called mapstruct. So you have the option to enable that, because otherwise your REST endpoints will just expose your entities directly. So I don't like doing that. So I like to use DTOs. And then if I use mapstruct, that means I don't have to do the mapping between the entities and the DTOs. And the reason for that is because I'm a little bit lazy. And then furthermore, I also prefer implementing implementation classes for the services. Now, these services are the Spring services, for those of you that are familiar with Spring. What it'll do is it'll generate an interface, but then also generate a separate interface class as well. So if we switch back, then I hope the backend has completed, and it did indeed. So if we just scroll back, what it did is it scaffolded the whole application for us, and also ran the build. And it looks like all of this was successful. And then it spits out some commands or some suggestions for you. If you want to run the application, you can just type that command. If you want to run the front end separately, you can just run npm start. Before I do that, I actually just want to switch to my IDE, and I'm going to drag it across to the other screen so you guys can see it better, because I want to actually show you what was created. So by just running that CLI earlier, what it actually created was this whole project for us. Again, for those of you that are familiar with the Spring application, this is a stock standard Spring application. If we dive into the source, you'll see main. There's a separate folder for Docker. So as you can see here, it's got built-in support for Prometheus, for Grafana. This is the Docker config for this particular app. And there's also support for MySQL, because we chose MySQL for the database, and then also SonarQube. Let's have a look at the structure of the app. We're not going to go into too much detail, but I just want to highlight this because it should be familiar to all of you. This contains all the Spring configuration. So if we look at the database configuration, stock standard configuration as far as Spring is concerned. So this is your database config. I'm not going to go through all of them. I think I'm just going to highlight some of the interesting ones. So this is your security configuration, which extends web security configure adapter. If we drill down further, here's our domain model. Now, I haven't generated the domain model yet, but this is actually a backup of what I did earlier. So speaking from experience, you don't necessarily want to use all your live stuff, because if something goes wrong, your whole presentation is going to bomb out. So what I did before was I actually generated this application before. But this is then the domain model that was created. So there you see the mission, the payload, and the rocket. And these are stock standard JPA entities. If we drill down further, this is the repository. As I mentioned before, it's leveraging Spring data. So all it creates for you are the repositories. These are the security. This is the service layer. So I mentioned that we asked it to generate the interfaces for us, and these are then the implementation classes. So by default, what we asked it to do here is to generate a CRUD application for us. So the service layer implements all the CRUD operations on your domain entity. And then also, I just want to mention here, this is the DTOs that was created. And if you go to your REST endpoints, these classes will be used in your REST endpoints. For example, the mission resource, this is the API endpoint that exposes the mission domain entity. Great, so that's all on the back end. If we dive to the front end, then for those of you that are familiar with front-end development, this is a full-blown Vue application. By the way, we chose it to be a monolithic application, but in fact, what JHipster does, it generates for you a backend application and a front-end application, which are completely decoupled, and it's communicating to each other via REST interface. So what we've done in the past, and what I've done in the past, is to generate a monolith but then you have the option of creating a full-blown standalone front-end application and not leveraging the front-end that gets created by JHipster. It's still useful, and this is something that I'm going to show you now why I think it's useful. Anyway, we're not going to go into too much detail here, but this is the front-end application that gets created. So I'm going to switch back to what I've created before and just type this method. So what this is going to do is it comes bundled with the Maven wrapper, so you don't have to have Maven installed in your development machine. And what this is doing, it's compiling, building, and then in fact going to run our application. So let's just give that a couple of seconds. It shouldn't take too long. While we wait for that, nearly there we go. And we are, by default, we're running in dev mode, and it spits out the URL that we can use. So I'm going to just copy and paste that. And if I open up a browser, this is what gets created. So first of all, this is the landing page. And to access it, let's log in. And this just proves that the security is also working. So by default, it provisions 2 users for you. A very secure admin by default. And let's just get rid of these screens. This is then what you'll see. Now, homepage is just where we are now. I'm going to ignore the entities for now, but let's have a look at this tab. So only the admin user has access to this. But a few things that are interesting here is the user management. These are the 2 users that are created by default. If you want to create a new user, we've got a whole form that we can use to create new users. If we go to metrics, this is very useful. This is a page on the front end that leverages the Spring actuator on the back end to show you what's going on in your application. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but as you can see, it gives you some info about your system, memory, how many threads you're running, CPU usage. Of course, we're doing nothing now, so you don't even see that. We've got HTTP requests. You can see what the count is for all your endpoints that you're hitting. We haven't exercised this yet, so this is why this is low. Gives you information about your cache statistics, and then also about your data source. So very useful as far as I'm concerned. By the way, this is leveraging Spring actuators. So this is also the endpoint that gets exposed if you use Prometheus. That'll get scraped and pulled into Prometheus at a later stage as well. The other thing that's very interesting is we've got the logs. This is where you can switch on and off dynamic logging. The API, very, very useful. This is built-in Swagger support for your API that you created, for those of you that are familiar with that. And then also the database. This stage, it's just using the built-in H2 database, so we're not going to use that now. What I want to show you here is also the support for the language. We've got, if we switch to Dutch, the whole application changes. If we switch to French, there we go. Very funky. And let's switch back to English. What I want to show you as well, we've created entities now, and what JHipster does is it creates a full-blown CRUD application for you. So once you create the entities, you can already see them here, and it's configured to seed your database with data. So that's why this is populated now. Yeah, you have the option to switch that off, but what you see here are all the entities. It's got the CRUD functionality for you. So in other words, the full list. We can view them, we can edit them, and obviously delete them. I'm not going to do that now, but let's go for maybe the rocket or what was the other one? The payload that I wanted to show you. So if we edit, for example, the payload, We can choose which mission the payload belongs to, and then save it, and there you go. So a full-blown application generated in literally, what, how many minutes was that? 5 or 10? I'm not sure. But anyway, as you can see, quite useful. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation mode, because that was what I wanted to show you as far as the demo is concerned. So let's just quickly talk about then, what is under the iceberg that I didn't show you. As I mentioned before, JHipster also supports microservices, which is originally based on the Netflix OSS stack. And in fact, that's probably more powerful than what I showed you now. So I really invite you to have a look at the support specifically for microservices. The last question you saw when we ran through that CLI was whether we want to enable modules or blueprints. Now, this is something I can maybe switch to as well. As I mentioned, the community is quite huge, and there are a lot of other contributors that also created, let's call it, plugins for JHipster. I named a few here. For example, there's support for Ionic. There's support for React Native. For those of you guys that are interested in Quarkus or Micronaut, there's even support for that. I mentioned in the beginning, you don't have to use Java. There's support for Kotlin as well, so you can generate your application using Kotlin. I think I might just actually take some time to flip over to the JHipster page. And if we go to modules and blueprints, these are the official blueprints. As I mentioned, Kotlin, Vue. We saw the Vue one. This is the one I was showing you. .NET, Node.js, Micronaut, Quarkus. And then in the marketplace, there are quite a big load of different plugins that you can try out. I've used some of them in some of them before in the past, but have a look. It's quite an extensive list. So yeah, other tips and tricks from my experience. As far as I'm concerned, the JHipster tool is quite flexible. So it's one of those tools that don't prescribe only one way to do things. It's quite flexible in the sense that you can sort of like pick and choose what you want to use. What I demonstrated now was a monolithic app, but as I said, you still have the option to, for example, not use the front end and then create your own front end. And this is something that we've done in the past. But in the end, it's just a Spring application. So you can generate your application and then ask JHipster to step out of the way and take it further from there. So from that point of view, I find it very flexible. So you're not in and then you're tied to JHipster, although they have the option to sort of like walk with you as you develop, but you're not tied into it. So it's not one of those tools that you hooked and then you can't get rid of it. Then for some closing or final thoughts from my side, technology, as far as I'm concerned, is evolving at quite a rapid pace. And a couple of years ago, CRUD was sort of like the sort of like the architectural choice that people made. These days, things are changing. People are switching to microservices architecture. Event streaming and event sourcing are becoming more popular. At this stage, JHipster very much supports the CRUD model. Now, in a lot of cases, this might work for you, but not in all cases. So keep that in mind when you make a decision. What do you want to, what your application will be like. I think the point I want to make is this is not the only tool out there, and think about what you want to use, but it is quite a useful tool. So bear that in mind. And then I want to close off by, just leaving you with some reference material. I don't know if we'll be sharing this slide deck later, but otherwise, please have a look at the JHipster website. They even have some official slides on their side, which are much more thorough than what I showed you tonight. Have a look at the blueprints. Those are very interesting, and I think this is where a lot of future activity will be. And then also the marketplace, which we touched on briefly. And we are on 40 minutes now, so that's not bad timing, I guess, from my side. I want to close by saying thank you to all of you. If you want to reach out, please find me on LinkedIn. This is my LinkedIn in profile. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section, and I'll be happy to answer you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jacques, for the clear explanation. And so nice to see that we have viewers all over the world. So hello, Amsterdam and South Africa and Germany and Saudi Arabia. Wow, fantastic.
Wow, a full-on international audience.
Yeah, great. Indeed. And sorry, Jacques, but because it's all over the news, what type of logging is JHipster use?
What type of logging? I give you one chance to take a guess, Leonie. But indeed, no. it's using Log4j, and I must be honest, I haven't had a chance to look what version of Log4j they're using, but I'd be very sure that they will patch this very quickly. But as I mentioned before, you don't have to rely on the JHipster team to fix this. You can dive right in. It's a Maven or Gradle application, and you can update your own dependencies. So it shouldn't be a problem.
Good to hear. And in your presentation, I see that you are a fan of space. And in your application, you mentioned a number of rocket types, including the Falcon Heavy. And Elon Musk is already working on some private flight to space. Do you have any ambition to fly maybe with the Falcon Heavy or the Falcon 9 to space?
Oh, well, if you talk about ambition, let's put it like that. I'd rather choose going up with one of the Falcon rockets than the Blue Origin rockets. I think a 3-day trip in space is much better than a 11-minute trip to the Kármán line. But at this stage, yeah, I don't know what the pricing is for the flights on Crew Dragon. But if I get invited, for sure, I'd be the first to say yes. So, Leonie, I don't know if you have context. I mean, Elon Musk is an ex-South African, but yeah, I haven't received any invite yet. So if you've got context, please let me know.
Well, maybe he's watching now, and we will see you. That's another question. JHipster sounds like a very magic framework that can do everything. So are there any reasons why we shouldn't use JHipster?
I think I touched on that before. Yeah, as I mentioned, technology is changing quite a lot, and I think if the problem you want to solve is not suited to what JHipster offer, then don't force it. I also mentioned it's quite flexible. So what I showed you now are the features that I think are interesting, but if you, for example, have an application that's not leveraging a database, it's not only a CRUD application. So by all means, you can leverage JHipster to generate microservices for you, which, for example, don't talk to a database, where you just, for example, plug into Kafka or something else. So it's quite. I think it's got a broad area of what it can do. Something that I haven't seen yet is where they're addressing the event sourcing or event streaming kind of applications. But in a way, they have support for Kafka, so there's no reason why you can't sort of like tweak it to fit that model. So again, I mean, it's not a yes or no question. Think about what you need and then evaluate whether it fits your requirements, and then take the plunge.
Yeah. Sounds like some good advice. And maybe some other question. Would you recommend to use JHipster only when building an application from scratch, or can you also use JHipster in an existing application?
No, that's going to be difficult. I think it's a lot easier to start, on a new application and use it, and then if you want get rid of it, I think it's going to be very difficult to introduce JHipster when you have an existing application. In fact, I think it'll be almost impossible. So purely because of the conventions that they use, which are not far removed from the the best practices, but yeah, it's going to be difficult. Yeah.
Okay. Let me check in the chat if I see some other questions.
But the only on that question, maybe one comment I can make on that point is, for example, if you have a backend API that are already exposing Swagger, for example, nothing prevents you from generating the front-end application by leveraging the Swagger API. So that's also an option. So depending on what you want to do, you can use it.
Yeah, good point. I see we have a question in chat. It's from Pierre. Nice, Jacques. Can JHipster do a domain-driven design too, or is it up to the builder to add an app and infra module?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but let me just read it again. Can do a domain-driven design. What I demonstrated here was pretty much a domain-driven design, although I went through it very quickly. We modeled the domain model, and then we, we scaffolded the application with it. As I said before, you don't have to just use JHipster at the start. As your application evolves, you can update your application with it. And I've certainly used that in the past, where the domain model grows and you add to it and then you enhance your application with it. So I would say, Pierre, yes, very much so. And I think this is where the JHipster Studio comes in very handy, because you can model your application visually instead of writing code, which makes it a lot easier to understand and communicate about it and share with your colleagues.
Yeah, well, sounds like a good feature of JHipster.